Everyone stepped back when the mafia boss walked in. She stepped forward, right up to him, looked him in the eyes, and asked him to marry her. What she didn't know, he had been waiting his whole life for someone who wasn't afraid of him. The fog came early that night. It rolled off the East River in thick gray sheets, swallowing the dock lights one by one until the entire waterfront looked like the edge of the world. 43 shipping containers sat in a perfect row, 12 armed men stood between them, and at the center of it all, hands in his pockets, completely still, stood Adrian Cole. No one spoke unless he spoke first. That was the first rule of being in his presence. The second rule was simpler. Don't look him directly in the eyes. Not because it was disrespectful, but because the men who had, most of them weren't around to talk about it anymore. Adrian was 34 years old, built like someone who had never known comfort, and wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's rent. His jaw was sharp, his expression was sharper, and the silence around him wasn't just quiet. It was earned. Years of it. Body by body, deal by deal, until the entire eastern seaboard understood one thing clearly. Adrian Cole didn't negotiate. He concluded. Tonight was a weapons exchange, Russian supply, Italian buyers, and a nervous middleman named Torres who kept wiping sweat from his forehead every 30 seconds. The crates had already been verified. The money was already counted. All that was left was the handshake, and then everyone could go home pretending none of this had happened. Torres finally exhaled. "We good?" Adrian looked at him the way a man looks at a clock. Useful, replaceable, nothing more. "We were good 20 minutes ago. You're the one still sweating." Nervous laughter from a few men. Not real laughter. The kind that keeps you alive. Adrian turned toward the water. He didn't need to watch the exchange. Everything here moved because he allowed it to. Everyone here breathed because he hadn't decided otherwise. That's when one of his men, Reyes, stationed at the south end of the dock, suddenly said something that had never been said before at one of these exchanges. "Boss." His voice was wrong. Not scared wrong. Confused wrong. Adrian turned slowly, and he saw her. She was walking straight through the middle of the dock, not sneaking, not running, walking, like she was crossing a parking lot. Like 12 armed men weren't slowly raising their weapons in her direction, like the fog itself should move out of her way, and somehow it seemed to. She was young, mid-20s maybe, dark hair pulled back, a worn jacket 2 sizes too big, and eyes that were doing something Adrian had never seen eyes do in a place like this. They were calm. His men looked at him. He gave nothing. His hand didn't move toward his weapon. He simply watched her close the distance between them, 30 feet, 20, 10, until she stopped so close that he could see the small scar running along her left collarbone. The entire dock had gone silent. Even Torres had stopped sweating. She looked up at him, direct, steady. "Marry me," she said. Not a question, not a joke. 2 words dropped into the cold night air like stones into still water. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then one of Adrian's men actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound, before cutting himself off when Adrian raised 1 finger, just one, and the dock went quiet again like a switch had been flipped. Adrian studied her face. He'd had guns pulled on him. He'd been ambushed, betrayed, and left for dead once in a parking garage in Newark. He had seen everything a life like his could produce. He had never had someone walk through an active arms deal and propose marriage. "You lost?" he asked. His voice was low, almost polite. "No." She didn't blink. "I've been looking for you for 5 years." Something shifted behind his eyes, but his face showed nothing. "You have 10 seconds to give me a reason not to let my men drag you off this dock." "That won't help you," she said. "I've already set something in motion. If I don't make a call by midnight, everything I know about tonight gets sent to 6 different federal inboxes. She tilted her head slightly. So dragging me off the dock only gives you a different kind of problem. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. Not the earned kind, the sharp kind, the kind that meant everyone on that dock, including Adrian, was doing math. Torres made a small, strangled sound and took one step backward. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then something crossed his face. Not anger, not amusement, but something rarer and more dangerous than either. Interest. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lena," she said. "Lena Hayes." He nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere important. Then he glanced at Reyes. "Take her to the warehouse." Lena didn't resist, didn't flinch. She let Reyes put a hand on her arm and turn her toward the dark building at the far end of the dock. And just before she moved out of earshot, she looked back over her shoulder at Adrian. "Don't keep me waiting too long," she said. "We have a lot to talk about." Adrian watched her go, and for the first time in a very long time, he had no idea what was about to happen next. The warehouse smelled like rust and old water, single bulb overhead, cracked concrete floor. 3 of Adrian's men stood near the entrance, weapons visible but lowered, because she hadn't fought, hadn't screamed, hadn't done anything that required a weapon. She'd simply walked in and sat down in the chair they pointed to, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. Like she'd been here before. Like this was all part of a plan she'd already finished writing. Adrian walked in 7 minutes later. He pulled up a chair, turned it backward, and sat facing her with his arms resting across the top. Up close, in the pale light, he noticed things he hadn't on the dock. The tiredness behind her eyes, the way her jaw was set, not in fear, but in the particular tension of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times they were almost numb to it. "The phone," he said simply. "Doesn't matter. The emails are already scheduled. If I cancel them, they don't send. If I don't cancel them," she shrugged. "You already know the rest." "Could be a bluff." "Could be," she agreed. "You want to find out?" He studied her for a moment. Then he leaned back slightly. "Most people who sit in that chair start talking immediately, volunteering everything, names, locations, whatever they think will keep them breathing." "I know." "You're not doing that?" "No." "Why?" Lena looked at him steadily. "Because I'm not here to save myself. I'm here to make you listen. Those are 2 very different things." Adrian said nothing. He had a system for reading people, built over 15 years of sitting across from liars, dealers, and desperate men. He could usually find the crack within the first few minutes, the flicker of the eye, the breath held too long, the hands that couldn't stay still. Lena had no cracks. "Then talk," he said. "You've got the floor." She nodded, took a breath that wasn't shaky, more like someone stepping off a ledge they'd been standing on for a long time. 5 years ago, March. You were dealing with a territory problem in Williamsburg. A crew called the Renko Brothers had been moving product through a residential block without authorization. Your authorization. So you sent a message. Adrian's expression didn't change. He remembered the Renko situation. Messy, but resolved. "You ordered your men to clear the block," Lena continued. "Scare them out. Burn whatever needed burning. Your exact words, according to someone who was there, were, 'Make the block uncomfortable.'" "I've given a lot of orders," Adrian said evenly. "I know. You don't remember this one specifically." She paused. "But I do. Because the building they chose to burn, 114 Mercer Street, 4 stories, 16 units, wasn't a Renko property. It was residential. Families. Working people. Her voice didn't crack, but something behind it tightened. "My family." A beat of silence. "My father was on the 2nd floor. He had a bad leg, couldn't move fast. The fire started at 2 a.m., which means most people were asleep." She looked down at her hands for the first time, then back up. He didn't make it out. I did. Barely. The warehouse was very quiet. Adrian's face remained still, but his eyes moved, just slightly. The kind of movement that meant something was happening behind them that he wasn't ready to show. I spent 5 years rebuilding, she said. Different city, different name for a while, working jobs I hated, but I kept coming back to one thing. She leaned forward now, elbows on her knees. The man who gave the order never knew what he'd done. He moved on to the next problem, the next deal, the next block to burn. And I thought, what's the point of being angry at someone who doesn't even remember you exist? So you decided marriage was the answer, Adrian said, dry but not mocking. He was listening. I decided permanence was the answer. Her eyes didn't waver. I don't want your money. I don't want you in prison. You just run things from inside anyway. I don't want you dead, because dead men don't carry guilt. I want to be in your life, close enough that you can never forget what you did. Close enough that every time you make a decision that destroys someone, you have to look at me first. Adrian stared at her. It was the most unusual form of revenge he had ever encountered, and he had encountered many. That's insane, he said. Probably. You'd tie yourself to someone like me? For what? To be a conscience I never asked for? You don't get to ask for it, Lena said quietly. That's the point. He stood up, walked slowly toward the far wall, hands in his pockets, back to her. His men near the door exchanged a glance. They had never seen him turn his back on someone in an interrogation. Not once. Then he said something she didn't expect. 114 Mercer Street. She went still. He turned around. 16 units, March 11th. Fire started in the ground floor stairwell. He paused. I remember. Lena's breath caught, just barely. You said you gave a lot of orders. I do, but I also do my homework after things go wrong. His voice was different now. Not softer exactly, but stripped of something. One of my men reported civilian casualties the next morning. I asked for details. He gave me an address. Adrian looked at her with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite indifference. Something stuck uncomfortably between the two. Your father's name was Daniel Hayes. He was a high school janitor, 61 years old. The silence that hit Lena was total. She hadn't known he knew. She had built this entire plan on the assumption that she was invisible to him, a consequence he'd never catalogued. She had been catalogued. Why didn't you? She started. What would I have done? His voice was flat but not cruel. Shown up at your door? I'm not that kind of man, Lena. I noted it, and I moved on, because that's what I do. And there it was, said plainly, no dressing on it. I knew, and I moved on. The anger that rose in her chest was hotter than anything she'd felt in 5 years, hotter than grief, hotter than the fire itself. Her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Then you already know I'm telling the truth, she said, her voice low and controlled. And you know I have every reason to be sitting in this chair. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he walked back to his chair, sat down, and said something that would change everything that followed. You're not leaving tonight, and you're not being released. He tilted his head slightly. But you're also not being hurt. So whatever you planned for midnight, cancel it. Lena blinked. Why? Because I want to see how far you're actually willing to go. For the first time since she'd walked onto that dock, Lena Hayes didn't have an immediate answer. And somehow, that was more terrifying than anything else that had happened tonight. The penthouse was on the 41st floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, marble everything, a view of Manhattan that made the city look like something you could own, which, in Adrian's case, wasn't entirely untrue. Lena stood near the glass and looked out at it, her worn jacket still on, her arms folded, looking like someone who had been dropped into the wrong painting and was trying to figure out if she should say something about it. She hadn't slept. Neither had he, probably. But where she looked like someone who had survived a long night, Adrian looked like someone who had simply scheduled one. He was already dressed when she was brought up. Crisp white shirt, no tie, coffee in hand. A man entirely at home in a world most people would find suffocating. "Sit down," he said. Not unkind, not warm either. Somewhere in the middle. The tone of a man who had already decided something and was now managing its execution. Lena sat. He remained standing, which she understood immediately was intentional. This was his space, his rules. Last night she had controlled the dock. This morning, the balance had shifted. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "Which part?" "The permanence part." He set his coffee down. "You want to marry me to stay close, to be a reminder, a consequence with a face." He tilted his head. "It's not revenge in the traditional sense, I'll give you that." "It's the only kind that lasts," she said. Adrian moved to the window and stood beside her, both of them looking out at the city. For a moment, they were just two people watching traffic 30 stories below, a completely absurd image given everything that had led them here. "Here's my problem," he said. "I don't bring unknowns into my life. Not personally. Every person in my circle has been vetted, tested, and earned their place over years." He glanced at her sideways. "You walked in off the street 24 hours ago and proposed marriage at a weapons exchange. You understand why that's not something I can simply say yes to." "I understand perfectly," Lena said. "So say yes, slowly." He almost smiled. Almost. 7 days. She turned to look at him. "What?" "You stay here, in my world, not hidden away in a room. With me. Where I go, you go. You see what this life actually looks like from the inside. Every meeting, every arrangement, every ugly and inconvenient truth." He held her gaze. "If after 7 days you still want what you came here for, I'll consider the proposal." Lena stared at him. She had prepared for a dozen responses: anger, dismissal, a counteroffer involving money. This wasn't one of them. "You're testing me," she said. "I'm giving you the information you need to make a real decision. Most people who romanticize proximity to power have never actually touched it." His voice was even. 7 days. Then we talk." She should have hesitated. She knew that. Any rational person sitting across from a man like Adrian Cole, inside a penthouse they'd been brought to against their will, would pause before agreeing to spend a week voluntarily embedded in a criminal empire. "Fine," she said immediately. Something moved behind his eyes. Respect, maybe, or something colder that looked like it. "Fine," he repeated. The inner circle arrived at 11. 4 men. Lena knew one by reputation, Marco Vital, Adrian's right hand for the past 8 years. He was 50, silver-haired, immaculately dressed, and had the particular posture of a man who had never once in his life been told no and accepted it gracefully. He walked into the penthouse, saw Lena sitting at the far end of the dining table with a glass of water, and stopped moving entirely. Then he looked at Adrian. "Tell me she's staff." "She's a guest," Adrian said. "A guest." Marco said the word like it was in a foreign language he was being asked to speak. "The girl from the dock. Her name is Lena." "I don't care what her name is." Marco's voice dropped, which somehow made it sharper. "I care that she walked through an active exchange and is now sitting in your home. I care that we don't know who sent her, who she's connected to, or what she's already told people about last night." "She's not connected to anyone," Adrian said calmly, "and she hasn't told anyone anything useful." "You know this after one night?" "I know this after one conversation." Adrian poured himself more coffee like they were discussing weekend plans. "She stays for 7 days. After that, we reassess." Marco looked at Lena directly for the first time. It was not a friendly look. It was the look of a man calculating variables and finding that she was a variable he had no column for. "What exactly do you want?" he asked her. "To marry him," she said simply. The room went very still. One of the younger men near the door actually shifted his weight. Marco turned back to Adrian slowly. "She's either an informant, a lunatic, or both." "She's neither," Adrian said. "She's someone with a legitimate grievance and an unusual strategy. I find it interesting. You'll find it manageable." "Adrian." "Marco." His voice didn't rise. It never needed to. "I didn't ask for your approval. I'm giving you information so you can do your job properly." He set down his cup. "She's not to be touched, followed, or interfered with. Are we clear?" Marco's jaw tightened. He looked once more at Lena, long, measured, unfriendly, then nodded once. "Clear." But the word landed like a door closing. Not locked, just shut. And Lena understood, looking at Marco Vitale, that she had just made her first real enemy inside these walls. After the others left, the penthouse settled into a strange, suspended quiet. Adrian stood at his desk going through documents like she wasn't there. Lena walked the perimeter of the space slowly, looking at things without touching them. Bookshelves, framed maps, a glass case with what looked like a chess set inside. All the pieces were black. "Is that symbolic?" she asked, nodding at the case. He didn't look up. "It was a gift." "From who?" "Someone who lost to me." She almost laughed. Almost. She pressed her fingers against the glass lightly and looked at the board. Mid-game, pieces frozen in position. Someone had been losing badly when they decided to stop playing. "You keep the unfinished games," she said quietly. Now he looked up. "To remember?" she asked. He held her gaze for a moment. "To learn." Lena nodded slowly and pulled her hand back from the case. She walked to the window again and looked out at the city that belonged to him, trying to remember the exact shape of her plan, the one she'd spent 5 years sharpening into something precise and clean. It was still there, but something about the chess set bothered her, and she couldn't quite say why. A man who keeps unfinished games to learn from them was not the man she had prepared for. She had prepared for a monster. She was beginning to suspect the truth was considerably more complicated. The car ride to Atlantic City took 90 minutes. Adrian sat on one side of the back seat, Lena on the other, with enough space between them that a third person could have fit comfortably. He worked the entire drive. Phone calls in low, clipped tones, documents passed to him by a man in the passenger seat, a small laptop open on his knee. He didn't explain any of it to her. She didn't ask. She watched the city dissolve into highway, and the highway flatten into coastline, and she thought about the chess set, about the pieces frozen mid-game, about a man who kept things not as trophies, but as lessons. It bothered her more this morning than it had last night. The casino wasn't on the boardwalk. It was 3 blocks inland, a converted hotel, unmarked, the kind of building that looked permanently closed from the outside. 2 men at the door nodded as Adrian walked through. Inside, it was a different world entirely. Low lighting, green felt tables, the quiet mechanical sound of shuffling and stacking. Maybe 60 people. All of them the kind of wealthy that didn't need to announce itself. "Legitimate front?" Lena asked quietly as they moved through the floor. "Partially," Adrian said. "The games are real. The players are real. The money that moves through the back office isn't." She looked around. A dealer at the nearest table caught her eye briefly. Young, blank-faced, working with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned not to see things. "The staff," she said. "Do they know?" "The smart ones don't ask." "And the ones who do ask?" Adrian glanced at her sideways. "They find different employment." She filed that away and kept walking. He moved through the space like water, stopping briefly at certain tables, exchanging words she couldn't hear, receiving small nods from men she'd never be able to identify if asked. Everything here was surface. expensive, controlled surface underneath which something entirely different was breathing. She had known, intellectually, what his world looked like. She had researched it, mapped it, prepared herself for it. But preparation and proximity were different things. Standing in the middle of it, watching money disappear and reappear in different forms, watching men make eye contact that communicated entire conversations in a single second, was something no amount of research could fully replicate. She kept her face neutral. She was good at that now. 5 years of practice. At the back of the casino was a private room. Adrian left her near the bar while he went inside. 45 minutes. She nursed a club soda and watched the floor and tried to count the number of transactions she could identify just from body language and envelope shapes. She got to 11 before she stopped counting. When Adrian returned, his expression was unchanged, but his energy was different, slightly compressed, the way a person looks after a conversation that required considerable restraint. He picked up a glass from the bar, drank half of it, and said nothing. "Bad meeting?" she asked.
"Managed meeting." He set the glass down. "There's a difference."
"What went wrong?" He looked at her like he was deciding something. Then, which surprised her, he answered. "One of my distributors has been skimming. Small amounts, consistent pattern over 8 months." He said it without emotion, like a doctor reading a diagnosis. He was under the impression it was subtle enough to miss. It wasn't. No. He straightened his cuff. It never is. Lena looked at him carefully. "What happens to him?" Adrian met her gaze. "What do you think happens?" She didn't look away. "I think you don't do anything immediately. You let him think he's gotten away with it. And then, when it's most useful to you, you use it." She paused. "You're not impulsive. You're patient. There's a difference." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like the slight recalibration of someone updating an assessment. "You've been studying me." "For 5 years," she said simply. "You're not as difficult to read as you think." He almost responded. She could see it forming, and then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and whatever he'd been about to say was folded away neatly behind the business of being Adrian Cole. It was later, standing near the window of her private lounge on the 2nd floor overlooking the casino floor, that she said it. She hadn't planned the timing. It simply arrived. Watching the tables below, the quiet performance of it all, the way violence hummed beneath every handshake and every green felt surface without ever actually appearing. "You don't even remember the lives you ruin." She said it quietly, not as an accusation this time, more like an observation she was reading from the room itself. But it landed the same way. Adrian was standing 6 feet away, looking at the same view. He didn't respond immediately, and for a man who always had something controlled and precise to say, the pause was long enough to mean something. "You said that to make me feel something," he said finally. "I said it because it's true." "Both can be accurate simultaneously." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the floor below. "Does it work?" she asked. "The separation? Treating it like logistics?" "It works well enough." "Until?" Now he turned. "Until what?" "You said it works well enough." She held his gaze. "That's not the same as completely, so until what?" Adrian looked at her for a moment with that expression she was beginning to recognize, the one where he was genuinely considering something instead of simply managing it. It made him look, briefly, like someone other than who he was. "Go downstairs," he said. "I'll be 10 minutes." She recognized a deflection when she heard one, but she also recognized that for a man like Adrian, being deflected on was a privilege, not a dismissal. She nodded and moved toward the door. She was almost through it when he spoke again. "The distributor," he said. "He has a daughter, 8 years old." He wasn't looking at her. "I know that. I knew it before the meeting." Lena went still. "I'm telling you that," he said carefully, "because you asked what I think about. When the separation doesn't work completely." He paused. "That's the answer." She stood in the doorway for a moment, not trusting herself to respond correctly. Then she nodded once and walked out. That night, alone in the guest room of the casino's private floor, Adrian did something he had not done since the morning after the Mercer Street fire. He pulled the incident file, the one he'd had compiled quietly, after the fact. Addresses, names, casualties. 16 units, 8 families displaced, 1 fatality. Daniel Hayes, 61, 2nd floor, Southeast Unit. He read it the way he read all reports, clinically. But somewhere around the third read, his jaw tightened, and he left it open on the desk until morning, which, for Adrian Cole, was the closest thing to sitting with something that he knew how to do. She didn't ask. That was the thing that caught him off guard. Most requests inside Adrian's world came packaged in careful language, framed as suggestions, buried in qualifications, softened enough to leave the asker an exit route if he said no. 5 years of running the Eastern Seaboard had conditioned everyone around him to approach him the way you'd approach a door you weren't sure was locked. Lena walked into the penthouse kitchen at 7 in the morning, poured herself coffee like she'd lived there for years, and said, "I need you to take me to Queens today." Not, "Can you?" Not, "Would you consider?" Just, "I need you to." Adrian looked up from his phone. "Queens?" "Mercer Street, or what's left of it." She held his gaze over the rim of her cup. "You read the file again last night. Don't tell me you didn't. I could see it in your face this morning. So stop managing it from a distance and come see it." The fact that she'd read him that accurately and said so without hesitation was enough to silence any refusal he might have formed. He put his phone down. "1 car," he said. "No convoy." She nodded. "Just us." They drove through 3 boroughs in near silence. Queens announced itself the way it always did, the skyline dropping, the streets widening, bodegas and laundromats replacing glass towers, the particular texture of a neighborhood that had been through things and simply kept going. Adrian had passed through Queens hundreds of times. Business ran in every borough, but he'd never had reason to stop here, specifically. He did now. The block had changed. Of course it had. 5 years was long enough for concrete to forget almost anything. New construction had filled 2 of the lots. A laundromat occupied the ground floor where a staircase used to be. The city had moved on with the efficient indifference it applied to everything. But not everything had been replaced. At the far end of the block, pressed against a chain-link fence that separated the sidewalk from a small patch of municipal garden, was a memorial plaque. Bronze, modest, bolted to a low brick wall. Lena walked directly to it like she'd walked to it 100 times, because she had. Adrian followed and stood beside her. The plaque listed 6 names, residents who hadn't made it out of various incidents on this block over a 10-year span. At the bottom, set slightly apart from the others, Daniel Hayes, beloved father, a man who showed up. Adrian read it twice. He didn't say anything. Lena was quiet for a long moment. The morning traffic moved behind them. A kid on a bicycle rattled past on the sidewalk. Ordinary city sounds, completely indifferent to the weight of 2 people standing in front of 6 names on a wall. "He used to leave a thermos of coffee at the school entrance every morning," she said. Her voice was even, practiced even. "For the crossing guard. Every single morning. 5 years running. Never missed once." She paused. He wasn't a remarkable man by any external measure. He didn't have money or influence or, she gestured vaguely without looking at Adrian, any of the things that make the world pay attention to a person. She exhaled slowly. But he showed up. For everything. Every time. Adrian said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be wrong. "You know what I thought about after?" Lena continued. "After the fire, after the funeral, after all of it. I kept thinking about the thermos. Whether the crossing guard knew what happened, whether someone told her, whether she waited for the coffee one morning and it just didn't come." She stopped, breathed. "That's the thing about people like you. You don't see the thermos. You only see the block. She said it without raising her voice, without turning toward him, and somehow that was worse than anger. It was the particular weight of someone who had already processed their grief into something dense and permanent. Adrian looked at the plaque, then at the new construction filling the burned lot next door. Clean brick, fresh mortar, the city's version of a closed chapter. "I gave the order," he said. It came out flat, not an apology, he wasn't built for those, just a fact placed down beside her fact. "I know you did." The target was the Rainco operation on the ground floor. The residential units above weren't... He stopped, heard how it sounded, and unexpectedly chose not to finish it. Lena turned to look at him for the first time since they'd arrived. Her eyes were dry, but they were burning with something that had clearly been burning for a long time. Weren't what? Weren't supposed to be there? Weren't part of the plan? Her voice stayed low, but the edges of it were sharp enough to cut. My father was asleep in his bed at 2 a.m, Adrian, in his own home. Where exactly was he supposed to be? I'm not making an excuse. Then stop forming sentences that sound like one. He closed his mouth, and then something happened that Lena clearly hadn't planned for, because it happened to her, not to him, and she had spent 5 years arranging for things to happen to him. It started as a breath she couldn't quite complete. Then her hand went to the top of the brick wall beside the plaque. Not dramatically, just steadying herself, the way a person does when the ground shifts slightly beneath them without warning. Her eyes stayed dry. Her spine stayed straight. But the composure she had worn like armor since the docks, the calm, calculated, absolutely unshakable composure, developed a fracture. Not a collapse, not tears, just a fracture, visible only because Adrian was watching closely enough to see it. She pressed her palm flat against the brick, breathed, and what came out of her in that moment wasn't grief. It was rage. Old, dense, thoroughly compressed rage that had been living inside a very small space for 5 years and had just run out of room. "I had a plan," she said quietly. The words came out strange, almost confused. "I had a plan for every part of this. What I'd say, how I'd stand, how I'd make you look at it." She shook her head slightly. "I didn't plan for it to still feel like this." Adrian stood very still. In 15 years of navigating dangerous people in dangerous situations, he had learned that there were moments when any movement, forward, backward, reaching out, stepping away, was wrong. This was one of those moments. So he simply stayed, present, silent, and close enough that his shoulder was almost touching hers. After a while, neither of them counted how long, Lena pulled her hand back from the brick, straightened, reset. The armor went back up, but slower this time, and slightly different in shape than before. "We should go," she said. "Whenever you're ready," he said. She wasn't ready for another few minutes. He didn't move. When they finally walked back to the car, Adrian paused once, briefly, and looked back at the plaque. A man who showed up. He got in the car, and something sat in his chest the entire drive back that he didn't have a word for. He searched for one, the way he'd search for a weakness in an opponent, systematically, thoroughly, without sentiment. The closest he could find was owing, but even that wasn't quite right. The first sign of trouble came at breakfast. Marco set a photograph on the table beside Adrian's coffee cup without saying anything. Adrian looked at it once, then again, slower. It was taken from a distance, grainy, clearly a surveillance shot. 2 figures standing beside a chain-link fence in Queens, a memorial plaque visible on the wall behind them. Adrian and Lena, yesterday morning, Mercer Street. "Who took this?" Adrian asked.
"Donatelli's people."
Marco's voice was controlled but tight. "It was sent to 3 separate contacts in our network this morning. As a message." Adrian looked up. "What kind of message?" Marco pulled out a chair and sat down, something he rarely did without being invited to, which told Adrian this was serious enough to skip the formality. "The kind that says, The great Adrian Cole has been walking through Queens looking at memorial plaques with a girl nobody can identify." He folded his hands on the table. "Donatelli's interpretation is that you've gone soft, that there's a weakness in the structure, and Donatelli, being Donatelli, interprets weakness as an open door." Lena had been standing near the kitchen entrance. She'd heard everything. She didn't move. Adrian looked at the photograph again. Something in his expression tightened. Not fear, not even anger exactly. More like the look of a man watching a clock run down faster than anticipated. "How long before he moves?" "He already has," Marco said. "We picked up communication last night. They know she's been with you since the docks. They don't know who she is yet, but they know she matters to you, which means she's now the most accessible pressure point you've ever had." The room was very quiet. Lena walked to the table and looked at the photograph herself. She looked at it for a long moment, both of them caught in an unguarded second, standing close together in front of her father's name. She hadn't known anyone was watching. She hadn't thought to check. "This is my fault," she said. "No," Adrian said flatly. "I brought you there. I made you visible in a place you'd never normally. Lena." His voice was firm, but not harsh. "This isn't your fault. Donatelli has been looking for a reason for 2 years. He would have found one regardless." He stood, decision already made, the way he always moved, without the performance of deliberation. "We're not staying in the city. Not tonight." Marco straightened. "The upstate property? Have it ready by noon." They were in the car by 11. Different vehicle this time, unmarked, civilian plates, nothing that announced itself. 2 men followed 2 cars behind, close enough to respond, far enough to be invisible. Adrian had shed the suit jacket, dark shirt, sleeves pushed up. It was the most undone she had ever seen him look, and somehow that small detail made everything feel more real than the casino, or the docks, or the penthouse had. He drove himself. That surprised her. She sat in the passenger seat watching the city compress into suburbs, and the suburbs open into highway, and the highway eventually give way to a quieter, greener kind of landscape. The Catskills rose in the distance, unhurried and enormous, completely indifferent to the trouble trailing behind them. "Have you ever wanted to leave?" she asked. Somewhere past the first hour, when the silence had become comfortable enough to break without ruining it, he kept his eyes on the road. "Where?" "Anywhere. All of it. The city, the organization, the—" She gestured vaguely. "Constant management of everything." He was quiet for a moment. "When I was 19, he said slowly, and she noticed he was choosing words more carefully than usual, the way people do when they're accessing something they don't normally touch. "I spent 3 months working a fishing boat out of Maine. Cash work, no questions asked. I thought I was running away from something." A pause. "Turned out I was just running. There's nothing to run to if you haven't changed what's following you." Lena looked at him. "Did you go back on your own?" He glanced sideways briefly. "What do you think?" She thought about the chess set, the unfinished games, the file left open on the desk until morning. "I think someone came and got you." He almost smiled. "My uncle. 2 men, a car, a very short conversation." He looked back at the road. "I've been running the operation since I was 22. 12 years. He said it without pride or complaint, just measurement. "Do you know what you'd be?" she asked. "Without all of it?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Probably still difficult," he said. "Just differently." She laughed, small, unexpected, real. The sound surprised them both. He looked at her again, brief, and this time the almost smile made it further than before. The safe house wasn't what she expected. It was a farmhouse. Actual wood siding, a covered porch, surrounded by a few acres of bare October trees. No marble, no floor-to-ceiling glass, no city humming 40 stories below. Just wind and the sound of it moving through branches, and the particular quiet that exists only when you're genuinely far from anything. Inside was simple: functional furniture, a fireplace, a kitchen stocked by someone who'd been called ahead. One of the two accompanying men took a perimeter position outside, the other stayed near the entrance. And then, essentially, it was just the two of them and a fire that needed lighting. Adrian lit it. Lena sat on the floor near the hearth with her knees pulled up, watching the kindling catch. The armor was off today, not cracked like at the plaque, but genuinely set aside, the way you put something down when you're too tired to carry it anymore. She looked younger without it, less like someone executing a 5-year plan, and more like someone who was 26 and exhausted and far from home. "Marco is going to try to remove me," she said, not a question. "He's going to try to persuade me to remove you," Adrian said. He was in the armchair across from her, watching the fire take hold. "Different thing." "Same result, if he succeeds." "He won't." Said simply, without drama. She looked at him. "Why are you protecting me? Actually, not the strategic version, the real one." He held her gaze. The firelight did something to the sharp lines of his face, softened the edges slightly, the way it softens everything. For a moment he looked like the man on the fishing boat in Maine, 19 years old, running without knowing it. "Because you came to that dock without a weapon," he said, "and everyone who comes to me brings weapons." He paused. "You brought a grievance. There's a difference." Lena stared at him. The fire was warm now, fully caught, orange and steady. "That's the most human thing you've said since I met you." "Don't repeat it." She looked back at the fire. "Adrian." "What?" "Thank you for coming with me yesterday. To Queens." She said it to the fire rather than to him. "You didn't have to." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that holds something rather than avoiding it. "Your father's plaque," he said finally. "The last line." She knew it without being asked. "A man who showed up." He nodded slowly, didn't say anything else, just nodded, like he was agreeing to something privately, a commitment made without witnesses, without terms, without the apparatus of his world to define it. Outside, the wind moved through the October trees. Inside, something shifted between them. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a season changes, so gradually that you can't point to the moment it happened, only to the fact that everything is different now. And that, Lena understood, was considerably more dangerous than anything that waited for them back in the city. The second day at the safe house was quieter than the first. No calls from Marco, no updates from the city. Adrian had turned his phone to silent sometime around midnight, which Lena suspected was something he'd never done before, or at least not voluntarily. The two men outside rotated shifts in 4-hour intervals. The fire was relit in the morning, and the farmhouse settled into a temporary stillness that felt borrowed, like something that belonged to a different life and had been lent to them by accident. They had spent the morning separately, Adrian at the kitchen table with documents, Lena walking the property. Bare trees, frost-hard ground, a stone wall at the far edge of the field that someone had built a very long time ago and nobody had knocked down yet. She walked the length of it twice, hands in her jacket pockets, trying to locate the clean, certain shape of her plan. It kept slipping slightly out of focus. By afternoon, they were both in the main room without having decided to be. Adrian on the armchair, Lena on the floor again. She kept choosing the floor, which he'd stopped remarking on. A pot of coffee between them on the low table, the fire going steadily. Outside, the sky had gone the flat gray of a day that wasn't going to offer anything more dramatic than itself. "Can I ask you something?" she said. He turned a page. "You're going to regardless." "The order." She kept her voice level. "Mercer Street. If you'd known, specifically known, that there were residential units above the target, not guessed, known." She looked at him directly. "Would you have done it differently?" He set the document down. He didn't answer immediately, which she had learned meant he was going to answer honestly rather than efficiently. "Yes," he said. "Why?" The outcome for the Renko operation would have been the same.
Because there's a version of this life I've always maintained, he said carefully. Operational lines, things that keep the machinery from becoming something else entirely. He looked at the fire. Civilian casualties aren't an operational outcome. They're a failure of information. And failures of information are... He paused. My responsibility. Yes, I would have done it differently.
Lena was quiet for a moment.
Then, and this was the part she hadn't prepared for, hadn't rehearsed, hadn't even recognized as a possibility until it arrived fully formed in her chest.
I believe you. She heard herself say it, and then sat with the strange, destabilizing weight of it. She believed him. Adrian looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not softened exactly, but opened slightly.
You didn't expect to, he said.
It wasn't a question.
No, she exhaled. I expected to be certain about you the entire time. I spent 5 years being certain. She looked down at her hands. You were supposed to stay simple. Simple. Guilty. Uncomplicated. Easy to hold in place. She said it quietly, almost to herself. You were supposed to be the version of you I built in my head. The one who doesn't remember Daniel Hayes, doesn't read files twice, doesn't drive himself to safe houses or leave fishing boats in Maine because someone came to get him. She shook her head. That version was easier to plan around. He watched her. And this version? She looked up. This version is a problem. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire moved. The gray sky outside had started to lose its light, afternoon collapsing into early dark the way it does in October, quickly and without ceremony. I want to show you something, Adrian said. He got up and went to the back room. She heard a drawer open. When he came back, he was holding an envelope, old, slightly worn at the corners, the kind that had been handled many times. He held it out. She took it and looked inside. Documents. A passport. Her name. Different photo. A bank account number printed on a card. A property deed for an address in a coastal town she'd heard of in Oregon. She looked up at him. What is this? A way out, he said. Clean identity, clean money, clean start. The account has enough to live on for years if you're careful. Longer if you're not. He remained standing. I had it prepared last night. Lena stared at the documents. The passport photo was recent, taken without her knowledge, which should have frightened her, and instead just confirmed how thorough he was. The Oregon address was a house, she guessed, somewhere quiet, somewhere with no dock, no penthouse, no chess set, no plaque. You're trying to give me an exit, she said. I'm giving you a real choice. What you walked onto that dock to force, you've done it. I've seen the plaque. I've read the file. I know what I cost you. You've made me know it. He held her gaze. You don't have to stay inside this to make it count. She turned the passport over in her hands, looked at the name, looked at the Oregon address, and then she put everything back in the envelope and held it out to him. He didn't take it immediately. Lena, if I walk away, she said, you forget again. I won't. Not immediately, not on purpose. Her voice was steady, but underneath it was something fierce and immovable. But slowly, because that's what happens when there's no weight to carry. Guilt without consequence dissolves, Adrian. You know it does. You've watched it happen in every man who ever worked for you. She set the envelope on the table between them. I'm not leaving. He looked at her for a long moment. You came here for revenge. I came here for permanence, she corrected. I told you that on the first night. And now? His voice was careful. After 5 days. After everything you've seen. After... He gestured slightly, meaning the fire and the farmhouse and Queens and all of it. Is it still the same reason? She hesitated, and the hesitation itself was an answer of sorts. Because the old Lena,
The one who'd rehearsed this for 5 years would not have hesitated. The old Lena had been built entirely of certainty. "No," she admitted, "it's not the same reason." She met his eyes. "But it's a reason, and it's mine, and it's enough." Adrian looked at her in the particular way she was beginning to recognize. Not the way he looked at problems or opponents or moving pieces on a board, but the way he looked at the unfinished chess game, like something that required understanding rather than solving. He picked up the envelope, walked back to the other room. She heard the drawer close. When he returned, he sat in the armchair without speaking, picked up his document, didn't read it. After a while, without looking up, he said, "You should have taken the out." "Probably," she agreed. "This gets harder from here." "I know." Silence. The fire, the dark outside pressing against the windows. "Lena." "What?" He looked up from the document he wasn't reading. His expression was stripped of the usual management. No performance, no calculation, no careful positioning of words before they left his mouth. Just the thing itself, plain and ungoverned. "I'm not sure I want you to leave either." She looked at him steadily, held it, let it settle. "I know," she said quietly. "That's the other problem." Neither of them spoke again for a long time. The fire burned down slowly between them, and neither of them moved to add more wood, and the room got gradually darker. And still, they stayed. Two people sitting inside a choice that had just become real in a way neither of them had planned for. Outside, the first snow of October began to fall, quietly, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. They drove back to the city in the morning. The snow from the night before had settled thinly on the fields around the farmhouse, just enough to change the color of everything without committing to a real winter. By the time they crossed back into Manhattan, it had already melted from the sidewalks, leaving only the particular gray wetness of a city that absorbs everything and shows almost nothing. Lena looked out the window and felt the city reassemble itself around her. The noise, the density, the feeling of 1,000 competing urgencies pressing against the glass. 6 days ago, she had walked through an arms deal on the Brooklyn docks. It felt, somehow, like a different lifetime. Like something that had happened to a slightly different version of herself. She wasn't sure if that was progress or a warning. The penthouse felt different when they returned, not physically. Same marble, same view, same chess set frozen mid-loss behind glass. But the atmosphere had changed. She could feel it the moment they stepped out of the elevator, something tighter in the air. 2 men she hadn't seen before positioned near the entrance to Adrian's office. Marco standing in the center of the living room, with his hands clasped in front of him like a man holding himself together by deliberate force. He looked at Lena, then at Adrian, then back to Lena with an expression that had graduated from unfriendly to something with sharper edges. "We need to talk," he said to Adrian. "Then talk," Adrian said, walking past him toward the kitchen. Marco followed. Lena stayed in the living room, not because she was told to, but because she wanted to hear clearly, and the acoustics were better from where she stood. "Donatelli made a move last night." Marco's voice was low and clipped. "He reached out to Carver and 2 members of the West Side distribution chain. Unofficial conversations. He's building a case internally that your judgment has been compromised." "By what, specifically?" "By her." A pause. "He's calling her a plant. FBI, DEA. He hasn't committed to a story yet. He's testing which version gets traction." Another pause. "Adrian, 3 of our own people asked me this morning whether it was true. Our own people." She heard the coffee cup set down on the counter. "And what did you tell them?" Adrian asked. "I told them I'd look into it, because that's all I could honestly say." Marco's voice tightened further. "I cannot defend a decision I don't understand. I've been with you for 8 years. I have never seen you bring someone into your personal space who wasn't fully vetted, fully tested, fully—" "She is fully known," Adrian said quietly. "I know exactly who she is and why she's here." "Then explain it to me, because from where I stand, a stranger walked onto the dock, said 2 words, and you've spent 6 days behaving like a man I don't recognize." A long silence. "I'm hosting the Kellerman Gala tonight," Adrian said finally. "Have Lena's clothes sorted, something appropriate." The silence that followed was the loudest Lena had heard in 6 days. "You're taking her to the gala," Marco said, flat, disbelieving. "I'm taking her to the gala." Footsteps. Marco appeared in the living room doorway and looked at Lena with an expression she'd remember for a long time. Not anger exactly, but the look of a man watching something irreversible begin and being unable to stop it. Then he straightened his jacket, turned, and left without another word. Lena looked toward the kitchen. Adrian was leaning against the counter, looking at the middle distance. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know." "It makes everything harder. For you, internally. Your organization is already—" "I know," he said again. He looked at her. "Get some rest. It's a long evening." The Kellerman Gala was held in a glass-roofed ballroom in Midtown that had been rented, along with everyone in it, for the purpose of maintaining the impression that Adrian Cole was a legitimate real estate developer with philanthropic interests and excellent taste in wine. The room was full of exactly the kind of people who knew exactly what Adrian was and had decided that proximity to power was worth the associated ambiguities. Politicians, developers, 3 judges, Lena counted from memory, a woman she recognized from a financial news channel, laughing at something near the bar, all of them immaculately dressed, expertly pleasant, and performing normalcy with the commitment of professionals. Lena wore a deep navy dress that someone on Marco's team had selected with obvious reluctance. It fit perfectly, which told her Adrian had arranged it himself. She walked in beside him and felt the room adjust, that subtle collective recalibration that happens when an unexpected variable enters a known equation. People noticed her. Of course they did. Adrian Cole had attended 6 consecutive years of this event without a companion. The absence had been its own statement. Tonight's presence was a louder one. He moved through the room the way he always moved, with complete assurance, speaking to exactly the people he intended to, for exactly as long as he intended to. She stayed close and watched, and collected information the way she'd trained herself to do. Faces, connections, the architecture of his legitimate world mapped out in real time across a ballroom. It was somewhere near the 3rd hour, during a lull between conversations, that he leaned slightly toward her and said quietly, "Are you ready?" She looked at him. "For what?" He didn't answer. He moved toward the center of the room, where a small elevated platform held a microphone for the evening's announcements. The room adjusted again, attention gathering the way it does when power clears its throat. Adrian picked up the microphone, said 3 sentences about the foundation they were ostensibly there to support, and then he paused. A deliberate pause, the kind that pulls a room completely taut. "I also want to take this opportunity," he said, his voice carrying the particular calm of someone dropping something heavy from a great height, "to introduce someone. Lena Hayes, my future wife." The room didn't erupt. Rooms like this don't erupt. The people in them are too practiced for that. But the silence that landed was dense enough to have its own weight. Heads turned. Eyes found her. Assessments were made in seconds by people who made their living making assessments quickly. Lena stood straight and held the attention of the room without blinking. She had walked through an arms deal 6 days ago. A ballroom full of people pretending they didn't know where Adrian's money came from was manageable by comparison. She felt his eyes on her from across the room. She didn't look back immediately. Just let the moment exist. Then she looked at him, and what she saw in his face wasn't performance. It wasn't strategic. It was something quieter and more unguarded than anything he'd shown her in 6 days. The car ride back was quiet. "You just painted a target on me," she said. I just made you untouchable, he corrected. Anyone who moves against you now moves against me directly. Donatelli, Marco's doubts, all of it. It changes the calculation. It also tells your entire organization that I have influence over you. You do, he said simply, as if that were an established fact rather than a concession. She looked out the window. The city moved past them, bright and indifferent. What happens tomorrow? The last day? He was quiet for a moment. We talk, properly, about what comes next. And if I've changed my mind? He looked at her then, steady, unhurried, the way he looked at things he'd already decided mattered to him. Have you? The car moved through the lit streets. The gala and the announcement and the weight of a room full of eyes receded behind them. Ask me tomorrow, she said. He nodded and looked back at the road ahead. She found the note under her coffee cup in the morning. Not a message on his phone, not a word passed through one of his men. An actual note, handwritten on plain paper in Adrian's precise, unhurried handwriting. The kind of script that looks like someone who learned penmanship seriously and never stopped caring about it. Rooftop, sunset, come alone. Lena read it twice, set it down, picked it up again. In 6 days, she had cataloged most of his habits, the early mornings, the documents, the way he processed difficult things by going quiet rather than loud, the coffee he drank without sugar because he'd said once, almost accidentally, that he didn't believe in making hard things easier than they were. A handwritten note was new. She folded it carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, which surprised her. She wasn't sure when she'd started keeping things. The day moved strangely. Marco came and went twice, both times with the clipped, contained energy of a man managing a situation he disapproved of, but had accepted. After the gala announcement, something in the dynamic had shifted. Not warmly, but definitely. Adrian had made his position clear in the most public way available to him, and Marco, whatever his reservations, was a man who understood the finality of public positions. He said nothing to Lena directly, but when he left the second time, he held the door for her as she passed through it. Small, but not nothing. She spent the afternoon alone in the penthouse, which she realized with a start had stopped feeling foreign. The marble floors, the glass, the frozen chess game, all of it had developed the particular familiarity of a place you've occupied long enough to stop consciously noticing. That realization settled in her chest with complicated weight. She hadn't planned to belong here. She'd planned to infiltrate, to anchor, to remind, not to recognize the place in her periphery without thinking about it. She sat in front of the chess set for a long time, looking at the abandoned mid-game, all black pieces, an opponent who had stopped playing. She thought about her father, about the thermos of coffee left at the school entrance every morning, about the crossing guard who had waited, one day, and found nothing there. She thought about the 5 years between that absence and this rooftop. And then she thought, for the first time without flinching, about what came after. The rooftop access was a single door at the top of a maintenance stairwell. No security up here, no men posted. Just the open city spreading outward in every direction, lit gold and amber in a late afternoon light. The particular light of a New York autumn evening that makes the whole impossible place look, briefly, like something that could be loved without conditions. Adrian was already there, standing at the railing with his back to the door, hands in his pockets, looking out at the skyline the way she imagined he'd looked at that ocean in Maine, like someone trying to locate something in a very large space. She crossed the roof and stood beside him. Below them, the city moved. Taxis, noise, the distant rhythm of 10,000 lives going about their business, entirely unaware that anything of consequence was happening 41 floors above. Neither of them spoke for a while. The wind came in off the river, cold and direct. "I have to tell you something," he said. His voice was different, stripped of the usual architecture. And I need you to hear it before you give me your answer." She waited. He turned to face her, and what she saw stopped her breathing for a moment, because for the first time in 7 days, Adrian Cole looked like a man without a position to maintain. The management was gone. The careful placement of words before they left his mouth, gone. Just him, standing in the cold wind, with something in his face that looked a great deal like the thing that most frightened capable people. Uncertainty. "I had another file," he said. "Not just Mercer Street." She went still. "When you came to the dock, I had you investigated. Immediately. Same night, while you were in the warehouse." He held her gaze. "By morning, I knew who you were. Your name, your history, your father." He paused. "And I knew something else." The wind moved between them. "The fire investigator's report from March 11th, he continued. "The official report listed the cause as an electrical fault in the ground floor wiring." He watched her face carefully. "That was the public record. The real record, my record, showed an accelerant in the stairwell. Deliberate. My men had exceeded the order. What I told them was intimidation. What they did was—" He stopped. "What they did was not what I ordered." Lena's breath came out slowly. "I'm not telling you that to reduce what happened," he said quickly. "It happened because of me. My order created the conditions, the chain of command I built, the culture I built, men who thought more destruction meant more loyalty. That is mine." His jaw tightened. "But I want you to know that the moment I read that report, the morning after, I had the 2 men responsible removed from the organization." She stared at him. "Removed?" "Permanently," he said, and let the word carry its full weight. The city hummed 41 floors below, a siren somewhere, a horn, the ordinary ongoing sound of everything continuing regardless. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. 7 days in. Why not the warehouse, or the casino, or Queens, or— "Because until tonight I wasn't sure you were staying," he said plainly. "And a man doesn't hand someone ammunition unless he trusts them with it." He paused. "I'm trusting you with it." The twist of it hit her somewhere she hadn't armored, because she had spent 5 years certain that her father's death was a careless order, forgotten and moved past. And it was. And it wasn't. It had been carried. Quietly, imperfectly, in the way a man like Adrian carries things, not with grief, but with a ledger entry that never fully closed. Her throat tightened. She turned toward the skyline. "I came here to trap you," she said. "I know. In guilt, in permanence. I wanted you chained to what you'd done." She shook her head slowly. "I told myself it was justice, that keeping you conscious of it was better than any other outcome." She laughed, short, without humor. "I was so certain I was the one with the plan." "You were," he said. "It worked." "It worked too well." She looked at him. "I didn't account for you being this, whatever this is." She gestured between them, imprecise and honest. "I trapped myself, Adrian. You said 7 days. I thought that was you buying time. It wasn't, was it?" "No," he said quietly. "It was me hoping." The word landed between them without armor. Hoping. From a man who had a word for everything and had spent 15 years ensuring he never needed to hope for anything because he controlled the outcomes. That word, from him, was not a small thing. She looked out at the city, at the lights coming on one by one as the gold faded from the sky. All those windows, all those lives behind them. Her father had moved through this city for 61 years, leaving thermoses of coffee at school entrances, and the city had kept going after him, like it keeps going after everyone. She had spent 5 years being angry at the machine for not stopping, and somewhere, in the last 7 days, without deciding to, She had stopped being angry at the machine and started being angry, and then something more than angry, at the man. Which meant he had become real to her, which meant she was in considerable trouble. "Ask me your question," she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "Stay because you want to, not because of the past." She took a breath of cold October air, held it, let it out. She thought about the fishing boat in Maine, the crossing guard and the missing thermos, the plaque that said, "A man who showed up," the envelope in the drawer with her name on a passport going nowhere now. She thought about the chess set, all black pieces abandoned mid-game. She thought that maybe the point was not to abandon the game. "The man I built in my head," she said slowly, "was a monster I could defeat and walk away from." She turned to face him fully. "You're not that man." "No." "You're worse," she said, "because you're someone I'd have to keep choosing, every day, knowing what you've done, knowing what you're still capable of, knowing it won't be clean or simple or—" She exhaled. "It won't ever be a fairy tale." "No," he said again. "It won't." She held his gaze in the cold wind on the rooftop above the city her father had loved. "Then I stay," she said. "Not for the past, not even to keep you accountable, though I will." She didn't look away. "I stay because you became a person to me, and I can't undo that, and I don't think I want to." Adrian looked at her for a long time. Something moved through his expression. Not relief exactly, not happiness in any conventional sense, something older and quieter than both. The look of a man who had spent 15 years building walls and had just, with full awareness, let someone stand permanently on the inside of them. He reached into his jacket and held something out. A chess piece. Black King. She took it, turned it over in her fingers. "From the set?" "I replaced it with a white one this afternoon," he said. "The game isn't abandoned anymore." She closed her hand around it. Below them, the city burned bright against the dark, indifferent and magnificent, carrying its dead and its living forward simultaneously, as cities do. They stood at the railing together as the last light left the sky. Not as a fairy tale, not as a conclusion, as a beginning that both of them understood would cost something, continuously, honestly, without the comfort of an easy ending. And they stayed anyway, which, in the end, was the only kind of staying that ever meant anything at all.